What's going on, everybody? Welcome in to Main Slate Matchups Week 12 edition. Second time doing this show, and Week 1 or Week 11 was such a success. Hopefully, we can duplicate that. So, you know where we had to start, right? We had to start by looking at the underdog success from this past week, going 8 for 8 on the main picks, and so many of these plays: Puka, Jamison, Jonnu, Booty, Brees Hall, Pickens, and MVS. Actually, Sutton too. All 8 came straight from the analysis on this show. And I think a crucial point about this, is that we're not using projections to make these picks. We are using the analysis of the matchups. We're using StatsHub. We're finding those micro advantages in the game that, underdog, price picks, sports books, they're not looking at the matchup at this level, this depth. So we can find some things that they're not finding, and also we can find some things that our opponents in DFS on DraftKings are not finding, and that's where the real money is made, right? It's finding those advantages that nobody else is finding. Everybody knows that the Detroit Lions are probably going to put up a bunch of points here against the Colts this week. Let's see if we can figure out which of those Lions are going to do so, and maybe anybody on Indianapolis that has an advantage. And of course, we'll go through the rest of the games. One thing we learned from last week's show, shout out to Albert. It was a really good one, and hopefully we can do it again. One thing we learned from last week's show is that if we just went game by game and dove into everything that way, this show would take 3 hours, 4 hours. So I've got some stuff prepared ahead of time. I'm going to focus on some of the main games, the most popular games, and then also just a couple peripheral matchups that I just think are really good and stand out as individual matchups. But just like we did last week, if you're here following along in the YouTube chat, reminder to everybody, if you're watching this on Twitter, appreciate you finding us there. Head on over to the FTN YouTube channel. You can find the show link on the FTN Fantasy Twitter. You can also find it on my Twitter at AlexBlickle1 over on Twitter. Get yourself in the YouTube chat so you can follow along live, ask questions. If you want me to dive into any matchup, I will. If you want to ask questions about the different things I'm doing in StatsHub or the DVOA pages, ask away, and I will answer all questions as we go through this. Obviously, I will be on StatsHub quite a bit, so I'm not going to see the live chat immediately. Just be in there, and I will periodically check back and try to get to all of the questions throughout the show. So with that, let's dive in. And let's see, where do I want to start? Let me bring up one second. Okay, so on DraftKings, the first game presented is Kansas City and Carolina. I'll talk for a minute about this game. It's obviously a great matchup for basically everybody on Kansas City. We can actually here. I'll bring up the DVOA adjusted fantasy points against data. For anybody who's not familiar with this, essentially what we're doing is, number one, we are adjusting for the strength of opponents. We don't want to look at just raw like fantasy points per game allowed to tight ends, for example, because what if a team just faced Kittle and then Kelsey and then Bowers and then Taysom Hill, right? We want to find the teams who are allowing more production than their opponent's average. And so even if that's allowing 12 fantasy points per game to bad tight ends, that means it's a better matchup than allowing 14 to Travis Kelsey, something like that. So that's what we want to see, and that's step one of what we're doing here with this DVOA adjusted fantasy points against data. And then we're also using just some key points from DVOA, key adjustments that are already made, baked in to the DVOA numbers to make these even more predictive. So when we look at Carolina, we can see they're a great matchup for everybody. Quarterbacks, running backs, tight ends, especially wide receivers as well, wide receiver ones here. I don't want to read too much into this. I think the number one thing that you need to keep in mind with Carolina is offenses can pretty much do what they want against them. So when we think about what Kansas City wants to do, well, they're going to try to run the ball a bunch, right? Kareem Hunt and Isaiah Pacheco now should be back in the fold. Andy Reid made some comments basically saying that they're both good players and they want to find opportunities for both. I think it'll probably be mostly Pacheco once he's fully healthy. First game back against Carolina, good chance we see a mix of both. So that's not great from a production standpoint in DFS. And then I think Kelsey can have a big game. Hopkins can have a big game. The problem is we're probably only looking at 3/4 of production from these guys, right? It'd be a little bit surprising if they're in a competitive game in the fourth quarter. It'd be even more surprising if they're in a competitive game in the fourth quarter, despite producing offensively in the first 3 quarters. That would mean Bryce Young has to actually put up a bunch of points against this Kansas City defense, which has been outstanding all season. So most likely, I will be not super interested in these guys from a DFS perspective, but it's also worth noting, look, either Kelsey, Hopkins, or any of these running backs could very easily have 2 touchdowns in the first half and be optimal well before this game gets out of hand and before backups potentially come in. So we can't completely ignore this game, but it's not something we need to spend a ton of time on diving into these individual matchups. Yeah, I mean, so this is a good point, Navari. One thing is, we just saw last week Detroit just absolutely just completely dominate and embarrass the Jacksonville Jaguars, continuing to keep the pedal down with the lead. We don't see many teams in the league do that, and we do already know what Andy Reid tends to do. It's not just that he will get a little bit more conservative in the second half. There was a time where Kansas City just chucked the ball and they would throw 5 touchdowns, 6 touchdowns. They keep throwing the ball downfield late in games back in the Tyreek Hill days. But that's not who they are anymore. They are a much more plodding offense, just getting down the field with a high success rate, not explosive plays, which also means they're very content to just drain clock now when they have a lead rather than really force it down opponents' throats. So certainly not the same type of matchup certainly not the same type of behavior with the lead that we just saw from Detroit. So we don't want to just automatically ignore a team because of blowout potential, but the purpose of this show is to find those matchups that nobody else is finding, right? We're not going to find that here. Everybody knows Kansas City could put up a bunch of points. Everybody knows this is an easy matchup for every single one of those Chiefs. So let's move on to a different game here. There's not a whole lot in Minnesota and Chicago. One thing I will point out here, Minnesota, as good as they are defensively, they have been a wonderful matchup for opposing wide receiver threes. We are still classifying Rome Odunze as the wide receiver 3, even though he just had 10 targets in his first game under the new offensive coordinator. So potentially a blow-up spot here for Odunze. That's pretty much all I'm interested in from this. Let's see what's next. Tennessee and Houston, another really, really boring game. You can see both of these teams, tough matchups across the board. Tennessee partially have been such a tough matchup from a fantasy perspective because teams often don't need to score very much against them. But that obviously could be the case here again. Houston playing quite well defensively. You can see they've been a fine matchup for wide receiver 2s, wide receiver 3s. The problem is Tennessee's offense is all their wide receiver 1, Calvin Ridley, and the running back, negative 22% for Pollard here, negative 21 for tight ends, neutral for opposing wide receiver 1. So if there is a way to attack this team, it's probably through Calvin Ridley, but nothing here that makes me absolutely love it, and nothing in the rest of the matchup that makes me love Ridley. So we can move on from there to what might be the DFS game of the week, or at least one of the best game environments, this Detroit and Indianapolis matchup. So let's dive into this one. Let's start with the Detroit defense and figure out, can we find anything from Indianapolis, right? Because we know Detroit is likely to put up points, but for this thing to turn into a great game environment, not just one where Detroit scores a bunch, but one where we want to actually turn this into a game stack, we're going to need to find something on the Indianapolis side. So let's see if we can do just that. They have been a difficult matchup for opposing quarterbacks, but they've been a great matchup for opposing wide receivers. So let's start there. Let's go into StatsHub and let's see what we can find here in terms of attacking this Detroit defense, particularly their secondary. So here we've got StatsHub up. Let's go to receiving. Let's go to defense and blow this up just a little bit so you guys can see it a little bit better. One awesome thing to point out, we have added single high and two high and cover 0 rates right here in the receiving advanced defense tab. So rather than having to bring up my own spreadsheet, download much data, we can just go right here, can look at single high rates, things of that nature. So we're looking for Detroit here. They are 14th in single high. That's not much of anything. They are third, however, in man coverage rate. So this is a pretty good place to start. Can we find anybody on Indianapolis who really thrives against man coverage? Player, advanced, and now we're going to use the advanced filter, man coverage. Over to coverages, man zone, man, apply that. And now I'm just going to bring up the Indianapolis Colts team. And sure enough, there is a wide receiver that catches my eye immediately. Josh Downs, 3.0 yards per run. Adonai Mitchell also up here at a really strong 3.1. However, he's only doing it on 59 routes. And let's check the last week. Pittman returned. How many routes did he run? Obviously only 4 against man coverage. Let's see if he was on the field at all. Otherwise, running some more routes. So only 5 routes run this past week. So we really can't go there, even though he has flashed against man coverage. Let me get rid of this filter. Let me put the man coverage back on. Oh, actually, I don't want to put the man coverage back on. We already saw Josh Downs looks great. So instead, what I'm going to do here is now I'm going to go one more level. Advanced filtering, receiving, route location, alignment from the slot. Josh Downs plays a ton from the slot, which you will see here in the routes run number. 175, strong 2.6 yards per route run out of the slot for Downs. So I, in particular, want to know, how is Detroit handling slot receivers? That's going to be another big part of this matchup. So advanced defense, I still have this on. I want to get rid of the team filter, but now I still see, or you can still see that I have this alignment slot on here. So now we're looking at team defenses, and let's see, yards allowed from the slot. Detroit is number 1, allowing 8.4 yards per route run. That is 8th worst out of the slot. So lots of production coming where Josh Downs is producing the most. So this is a fantastic spot for Josh Downs. I saw enough from Anthony Richardson and know that he's running enough that I'm pretty much in. And in fact, one thing we can do as well, can go to player rushing. Let's get rid of the filter. And let's put on a different filter here, rushing, run concepts. And I want designed to run true, where we can now see. Let's bring Indianapolis back up. And let's go to week 11 this past week. And you'll see 9 designed runs for Anthony Richardson. It's not new in the sense that, we haven't seen design runs for Anthony Richardson before, but this volume is new. They very, very much had a game plan completely centered around his skill set. The more we see him run, obviously that brings up the rushing touchdown equity. The more it means, no matter the matchup, he's going to be viable. And of course, if Josh Downs has that big game, is going to help bring along Anthony Richardson. So one thing I'm definitely looking at is just a skinny stack, Anthony Richardson to Josh Downs, and I would love to bring it back with at least one Detroit Lion. So let's now figure out which of the Lions we want to use. Let me quickly check in on the chat. Nine design runs and how many scrambles. Yeah, we can take a look at the scrambles real quick before I leave here. So rushing run concepts. We're going to skip out on the design run and go to true for the scramble. I'm not actually seeing any from him. That might be a surprise. I'll have to double check that unless I mess something else up here. It's possible that it just timed out. So let me refresh this, and then I will go back and check on the Indianapolis defense to see what we can find there. Oh, I don't need to even do that. Advanced filtering. I'm in the wrong spot. Rushing. That's what I needed to hit. I don't need Jared Goff. Wrong team. Maybe that's what I did wrong. Where are you, Indianapolis? There you are. Oh, my God. If I could click, that'd be helpful. Indianapolis. So 13 scrambles on the year, week 11. Yeah, we didn't chart him with any. So I'll double check that, but it's probably true. I know when I was watching the game, I didn't see any scrambles from him. They did, however, have a lot of designed runs for him, and it's going to be great for him. And of course, we can expect him to scramble in the future, regardless of what he did in week 11. So let's jump to the rushing advanced tab, look at defenses, and in particular, I want to see, yeah, Brian, we're definitely gonna be talking about Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sun God, here a little bit. But first, let's look at the rushing numbers on the season, and in particular, I'm interested in the explosive runs. This is timed out again, so let me refresh. Boom, rushing, advanced, defense. Scroll to the right, and let's look at explosive runs. And sure enough, there's Indianapolis at 48, tied for the league lead in the number of explosive runs that they have allowed. That screams Jahmyr Gibbs. They're also fourth. They've allowed the fourth most explosive rushing yards. And check this out, they've also allowed the most explosive rushing touchdowns. Now, one thing I do want to note here, this is getting super, super granular, but let's take a look at the Detroit Lions. And I just want you to note a pretty interesting split. Now, this is not super significant. Inside zone versus outside zone. Gibbs, 44% outside, 29% inside. Montgomery, 31% inside, 37% outside, and then 20% man. Ideally, what I would love to see from a matchup for Jahmyr Gibbs is a team that really struggles with outside zone. That says to Dan Campbell, to Ben Johnson, to this entire Detroit staff, the more we get Jahmyr Gibbs on the field, the better. When a team struggles with inside zone, it doesn't really hurt Gibbs. It's just not perfect for him because they're both going to get plenty of opportunities. That said, when we look at what the defense is struggling with the most here, as I'm going to clear those out, and now I'm going to go to rushing, run concepts, concept, outside zone. You will see Indianapolis has actually been fairly good against the outside zones, near the bottom here, actually 13th in explosive yards or explosive runs allowed, but they are way down at 18th in explosive rushing yards allowed on outside zones. They're also yards per carry against these outside zones way down at 27th worst. So actually, it's not 27th worst. It's 6th best, right? So this isn't a fantastic matchup from an outside zone perspective. Inside zone perspective, you can see they're allowing a ton, and obviously both of these guys are still getting lots of inside zone opportunities. So this is still going to be a big one that I like for Jahmyr Gibbs, and here you'll see why. They're allowing the 10th most yards per carry. So it's not like they're getting gashed every single time, but they are giving up a ton of explosives on the inside zone. 3 more than any other team, also 221 rushing yards. That leads the league. So Gibbs gets enough inside zone opportunities that this is still going to be a great spot for him. And I'm going to be very interested in where they open his longest rush at. I think over on Underdog, let's see, I'll bring this up. I don't believe that they have posted this yet. I want to pick them. Show me Jahmyr Gibbs. So yeah, they only have posted his 67.5 rushing yards, which I like. I will be happy to play this later in the week if they don't post a longest rush that I like more. My guess is that I'm going to like the longest rush more. So I'm going to hold off for now on this one. But let's jump back in, and now let's take a look at some of the receiving stuff now that we have already identified this as an explosive rushing matchup, which means I want Gibbs over Montgomery. If it's a team that just allows chunk run after chunk run, but they don't allow a ton in the open field, that's when I'm going to be more likely to go to Montgomery and just hope the touchdowns come. But with Gibbs, we have access to a much higher ceiling because he can break a 60-yarder for a score. He can give you that 100-yard bonus a lot easier than Montgomery can. And, of course, he can bring an explosive element to the passing game as well. We saw him almost break like a 70-yard touchdown reception last week against Jacksonville. So I'm going to lean Gibbs there as long as the ownership isn't heavily in his favor. But with that, let's now take a look at some passing stuff. Actually, I want receiving here, advanced. And let's see how Detroit is, or how Indianapolis is defending in the passing game. So let's see. They are 8th in zone rate. They are 7th in too high. So zone and too high, that's what I want to focus on for the offensive numbers from Detroit. And let's see who stands out in those two regards. Let's go to Detroit. Advanced filtering, receiving, coverages, and we'll start here with zone coverage. And nobody should be surprised here. It is Amon-Ra St. Brown at the very top, 2.4 yards per out run. Actually, we see David Montgomery up there as well. So I talked about what Gibbs brings to the passing game, but you can still see like Gibbs 99 routes run against zone to 66 for Montgomery. So even though Montgomery has been good in the passing game against zone coverages, he's just not the one running the routes enough. So we still are going to prefer Gibbs there in this way. Jameson Williams, interesting that he's at 2.1. However, that's going to fall off a lot more when we switch from zone to too high. And we can also look at zone and too high afterwards, but I always like looking at them individually first. And here you see bigger advantage, 2.6 for Amon-Ra St. Brown. David Montgomery showing up once again, and then Jameson drops to 1.8, which is not bad, but it's 1.8. And here you can see Laporta has been down near the bottom in both zone coverage and too high, which is why last week we were actually really interested in playing him before he was ruled out. So potentially not a Sam Laporta week. Seems much more like the Amon-Ra St. Brown type week. So yeah, it's expensive to go St. Brown and Gibbs, but it's going to be something that I at least explore doing because these guys could put up 30 and 35 together. They could put up 30 and 40 together. There is so much room, as we saw last week, for fantasy production on this Detroit offense. Is another really good matchup for them. And if Anthony Richardson can help the Colts push this Detroit offense, that's going to keep Gibbs on the field more. That's going to keep them throwing more to Mr. Dependable Amon-Ra St. Brown. So really, really like this game environment as a whole. And yeah, let's with that, let me check in on you guys say you can't see. I'm not sure. Oh, I was brain dead is what I was. I should have been showing this page. So here you can see this is the too high numbers, yards per route run, 2.6 for Amon-Ra St. Brown, down to 1.8 for Jameson Williams. And now if I go to the too high filter instead, or the zone coverage filter instead, you will see pretty much the same story here. It's Amon-Ra at the top, along with David Montgomery and then Jameson Williams down a little bit, but not down a ton, 2.1. So pretty much a little bit stronger than expected, but then Laporta just 1.6 and 0.8 against too high coverages so far this year. So as I said, this is a St. Brown week in my mind. Let's see what's next. All right. Next game is New England and Miami. This is a really, really interesting one from a DFS perspective. We just had a lot of success with that Puka Nacua play and the New England offense. We didn't expect Kendrick Bourne to take so many snaps, so Booty didn't have the DFS game we were hoping for, but he did still hit for us on that over 29.5 receiving yards, 32.5 receiving yards, whatever you got him at, turned out to be successful. So let's go take a look. Let's start with this. New England defense, because I think the best spot from this game targets the New England defense. So let's go 2 defenses here, and let's look at some single high and man numbers. And the very first thing that I'll point out, New England's 6th in single high rate. That is very important to note. They are also 9th in man coverage rate. So they have been a pretty good matchup for basically everybody offensively, plus 20% for wide receiver 1s, plus 44% for wide receiver 2s, negative 34% for wide receiver 3s. We talked about this last week, right? They are not giving up production to wide receiver threes because the quarterback doesn't have to go to that option. He can throw to his primary targets over and over and over and do so successfully. Also plus 10% for opposing running back. So just great matchup all around from this Miami offense, but it's especially good for one guy because of these man and single high rates. So when we go to player, when we go to receiving coverages, let's start with man. And let's just take a look at Miami. Look at some yards per route run numbers here. And there's nothing crazy here. 2.2 for Jonnu Smith, 2.0 for Tyreek Hill. Obviously, a lot of their weeks came without Tua. So I think even quicker than just kind of, we can filter by all of the weeks that it's just Tua. We can also just take a look at last season. This is so much the same offense, obviously the same personnel. 5.2 yards per route run for Tyreek Hill against man coverage last season. That wasn't just best by a mile on the Miami Dolphins. It was also, I don't even need to add any filters because there's Tyreek Hill, very clearly the best in the league last year against man coverage. Now, as we filter instead to single high, we're going to see pretty much the same story. Here we go, single high, and apply that. So throughout the entire season last year for all receivers, once again, we have a bunch of guys showing up that shouldn't with their sample size. Tyreek Hill, by the way, if you wanted to filter these out, you can very quickly add a filter. Go here, go targets. Let's say anyone who had at least, 30 targets. Boom, it adjusts, and there you can see Tyreek Hill was also the league leader in yards per run against single high. So this is a phenomenal spot for Tyreek Hill. We haven't seen the explosion in a long time. Last week, we thought, you know what? Just from a pure game theory standpoint, it made sense to use him, even though the Las Vegas matchup was not good for Tyreek. It was fantastic for Jonnu Smith. It was fantastic for Devon Achane. Tyreek Hill still had a very solid game. He put up 7 receptions, 61 yards, and a touchdown on 8 targets. He could duplicate those target numbers as like a floor this week, but also hit those explosive plays in a much, much bigger and more meaningful way. Let's go back to 2024. And let's take a look at the explosive numbers in the passing game. So I want passing, still on defense here, air yards. And let's take a look at these deep completion numbers. So New England not giving up a ton here, just 15th. But that can be taken advantage of, and 11th in total deep receiving yards, almost all that coming single high and man coverage. So unbelievable spot for Tyreek Hill. Hopefully he is low owned once again. Let me see. What is his price tag? $7,200 on DraftKings. It continues to come down, but even at $7,400, he was low owned last week. And I think that Devon Achane is going to get plenty of attention once again. So this should be another really, really solid spot to attack Tyreek Hill, hopefully leveraging some Achane chalk, although this is also a good spot for Achane. Do you think Christian Gonzalez will lock in on Tyreek Hill? No, I don't. I mean, look at the DVOA numbers, right? If Christian Gonzalez was just locking down wide receiver ones, we wouldn't see plus 20%. In fact, a lot of last game, we saw him on Demarcus Robinson. Miami moves Tyreek around all the time. It makes it impossible to shadow him. And even if he was one-on-one with him every single play, I couldn't care less, right? No matter who it is, you're not going to be able to lock down Tyreek Hill one-on-one. In fact, if they are relying on Christian Gonzalez to do that and therefore not sending extra help his way when they're in single high, when they're in man coverage, that means Tyreek Hill is going the distance at least once in the game. So, no, I am not worried at all about Christian Gonzalez in this matchup. This is just an awesome spot for Tyreek. All right, where to next? Oh, let's flip it over to the New England side. Most of the time, as I talk through this stuff, I want to be highlighting good matchups. But in this case, I also want to point out, as tempting as it may be to then find a bring back from New England, this is a difficult spot to do so, because when we look at the Miami defensive traits, we can see they play more zone. They are 7th in zone coverage rate. And were they also playing a lot of too high? I can't remember. 13th in too high. So it's mostly just zone. How how are the New England guys doing against zone coverage players? And here I am going to say, let's just look at week 6 and beyond. That's when Drake May took over. 9, 10, and 11 from New England. Looking at all these guys, I want the yards per route run numbers. And here's the problem. The yards per route run numbers are not very good. 1.6 for Hooper. Hunter Henry, 1.4 is fine, but like Kendrick Bourne, only 1.0. 0.9 for Kayshon Boutte. These are not good numbers. These are not good numbers at all, my friends. So it seems like Drake May has struggled a little bit more with zone coverage than man early on in his career. Miami's going to play a ton of zone against him. You can use somebody. If you are, I would certainly make it one of these tight ends. I would have much more interest in Hunter Henry if Hooper wasn't taking on more of a role. We can also see in the DVOA data, Miami has only been a good matchup for opposing tight ends, plus 11%. Everyone else negative, although plus 4% for running backs. Stevenson hasn't done a ton in the passing game in that regard, but we can also take a look at the adjusted line yards. Let me bring those up. Maybe we'll find something on the ground here where we can go to Stevenson. So adjusted line yards, the defense, and let's see, adjusted line yards, Miami, 18th. So obviously not a great matchup. And then open field yards, they are 18th as well. So it's a fine matchup for Stevenson, I would say. Certainly nothing crazy to like about it. I would also say there's not a ton of correlation between Stevenson and Tyreek Hill. So you're kind of losing the point of a mini stack anyway. So yeah, I don't really love anyone on this New England side. It makes me just want to use Tyreek as a one-off, which would also then be even better if Achane is super popular and we can leverage that with the Tyreek Hill play and hope the game doesn't go off as a whole. Good question here. Is Miami still the highest motion team? So I actually wrote a lot about motion today talking about Aaron Rodgers. Let me go back into StatsHub and we can take a look. Actually, I don't even need to take a look. I can tell you from memory from my stuff earlier, yes, they are still number 1 in motion. For some context, Aaron Rodgers has had motion on 34% of his pass attempts. Tua leading the league, over 77% of his pass attempts have come on a play with either pre-snap or during the snap motion. So good question there. And yes, they are still using a ton, which is also why we won't see Christian Gonzalez able to shadow Tyreek Hill, even if they wanted to. And even if they wanted to, and he could, I would be all over Tyreek Hill still. So no concern there. All right, what game is next? Moving on, we have Tampa and New York. There's not a ton I want to mention from this game, and part of that is the Giants have really become a fairly tough match across the board. If you remember, wide receiver ones were really, really crushing them early in the season. So the fact that they're only plus 7% now shows that they have actually done a good job with opposing wide receiver ones, and part of that is they have really used, again, a safety over the top of tons, starting with that matchup with Cincinnati against Jamar Chase. So that is where there is some hesitation here, but we are still seeing a lot of single high coverage from them. So let me bring all of this data up here for this matchup. I need to clear this. So receiving, advanced, defense, once again, and let's head over and let's take a look at man coverage. So New York, nothing crazy here, 15th. It's single high coverage. They are using it the second most in the league. That's why we just had that great spot for Marcus Valdes-Scantling against Cleveland. By the way, if you are looking for something on Kansas City in that matchup with Carolina, it is noteworthy they are using single high, the third most. However, that could be in large part because they are trailing by so much. So often they know that their opponents are going to run the ball. So we actually could, if we wanted to, dive deeper here. We have some game environment filters. So like general game script, you could say tie game or one possession lead or one possession trail. Apply all those and see if that single high rate is still super high or if it's only because they are trailing so damn often. If you wanted to, I'm not going to dive that deep into that matchup, at least not right now. I'll probably do that later in the week because that would like make Xavier Worthy an interesting one. Maybe they finally connect on a deep one to him and he gets the 100-yard bonus and he is this week's Jamison Williams. So I'm not going to totally dismiss that. I will take a deeper look at that. But for now, let's just focus on this matchup in New York. The reason why I care so much about this is because Mike Evans just absolutely torches single high coverages. So let's go take a look at that performance. I want single high. And because he's been out a bunch this year, I will also take a look at last year's numbers. So Tampa Bay yards per route run. If I recall correctly, he's at 2.1 here. I need players, not defenses. Tampa Bay yards per route run, 2.2, a little bit off. Leading the team, so we still see that. But last year, it was even stronger all the way up at 3.1 yards per route run. Near the top of the league, I believe that was top 5. So also 6 touchdowns a year ago against single high. When he gets single high, they throw him that jump ball, those one-on-one routes on the sideline, and he just scores touchdown after touchdown. So definitely a good spot for Mike Evans. It's also, by the way, a spot on Underdog where let me bring this up now. Let's see what they have for him. So already a 21.5 longest reception for Mike Evans. I'm going to be interested in that. Extremely interested in the 55.5 receiving yards. I'll also be interested in potentially laddering that because that number strikes me as just significantly too low. 4.4x for 100 yards seems outstanding in this matchup if New York can do anything, although I wish it was Daniel Jones still. Not many people have said that in their lives, but Tommy DeVito, not the answer. If it was Drew Lock, I would also be more interested there. In fact, I don't even think it's worth talking about Tampa's defense because I'm not going to trust DeVito to do a damn thing. I will also hope that they add some touchdown odds here with a multiplier for Mike Evans because I think there's just a fantastic chance of him scoring. But let's go back to the matchup here and let's clear all of this. And one last thing I want to note from this matchup, let's go to air yards. And even as New York has started to do better against those wide receiver ones, even as they have started to play more over the top coverage, they are still tied for 4th in most deep completions allowed. So this really is a great spot for Mike Evans all around. DFS one-off as well, very much worthwhile. Yeah, he's going to be back. At least that's the expectation. He does, Cat Guy. That's a great point. If you want a narrative behind this one, they've got some catching up to do to get Mike Evans back to 1,000 yards, and it might come. He might be very much on track after this week if they just continue to throw the ball to him. And this Tampa team is so high in pass rate over expectation because they don't run the ball well. Granted, they have run the ball better with Bucky Irving, but Baker Mayfield has no issue with slinging it. Even with a late lead. So, even if they're calling plays late where they're saying, hey, Baker, why don't you be a little bit conservative here? If he sees that single coverage on the outside, he's slinging it. So, this is a home run spot for Mike Evans. Hopefully he's going to be low owned and we will take advantage of that. And certainly I will be on his props. I'm a little bit worried that by the time I can actually put some of these plays in, I'm in Pennsylvania right now, so I'm not getting back to Virginia until probably late tomorrow night. I'm worried this is already going to be 59.5, 60.5, but hopefully we have plenty to like. And I really, really hope that this 99.5 number stays 4.4x and doesn't fall to like 3x or something significantly lower like that, because I will be playing this without question. All right, let's see what's next. Dallas and Washington is the next game. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this one. I will mention the fact that Washington is still a very solid matchup for opposing wide receiver ones. Like New York, they came crashing down in this number for some of the year, and it actually has started to creep back up. So they are still a great matchup for CeeDee Lamb. I've also noticed that as they have gotten better, I think they are still struggling a little bit more with the guy who kind of moves all around and doesn't just line up on the outside over and over and over again. So that's also benefit for CeeDee Lamb. Although the main benefit here is that they're probably going to be trailing. They're probably going to throw it a ton of times, and Cooper Rush only throws it to CeeDee Lamb, it seems. So as long as Rush isn't surprisingly benched, I don't want to react too strongly to the performance CeeDee Lamb just put up, because Cooper Rush threw the ball 55 times against Houston in that 34-10 loss. If they're trailing, they're probably going to be throwing it again, but Washington has done a much better job than Houston of controlling the ball offensively. So it's not that I think their pass rate will drop against Washington, it's that I think their overall play volume will drop. So I don't want to speak too highly of this spot for CeeDee Lamb. All right. Let's see. Anything else here in the chat? Nothing there. So truth be told, I have not looked at the final two games, San Francisco, Green Bay, and Arizona, Seattle yet. There's not a ton to talk about in the Denver matchup, but there is one thing I want to touch on. Because if for no other reason, then we should keep this in the back of our minds and really take advantage when the right matchup shows up. When we go to receiving and advanced and defense, and we look at those single high numbers, you'll notice we don't see Las Vegas at the top here. We don't see Las Vegas at the top of too high either. How can that be? Quite simple. They are playing zero coverage. I need to refresh this. Defense, receiving, advanced. Over here, they are playing zero coverage. So zero blitz, man coverage, no high safeties. Everybody is one-on-one. If you get beat, you give up a touchdown. It's that simple. 10.4% of the time, no other team higher than 7.4%, and that is Steve Spagnuolo, who we know loves to blitz and blitz and blitz. So this is a crazy finding. Las Vegas playing tons and tons of zero coverage. The problem is when we look at this Denver offense, we have two problems here. Number one, Bo Nix has not done well against zero coverage at all. For this, we need to go to shell coverage, cover zero, and apply that. So if we sort by yards per attempt, we'll see Bo Nix is way down the list here. 32nd at 2.1. The second problem, though, is he's only faced it for 12 attempts. Now, no quarterback has faced it a ton. Like you'll see here, the most anyone has faced it is Joe Burrow at 26 attempts. Surprising that his yards per attempt is so low. Yards per attempt isn't the best metric to use here because more often than not, when we do see zero blitzes, or not necessarily more often than not, but often when we see zero blitzes, it's in the red zone. It's where they don't need to worry about giving up a 60-yard touchdown. So sometimes yards per attempt can be low just because a quarterback has typically only faced it in that red zone where they can't get some explosive plays, things of that nature. But it's just really hard there to actually find who benefits the most, because we only have a sample of 12 for pass attempts. How the heck are we going to get a good enough sample for which receiver really benefits? And on top of that, when we look at the receivers who have done the best in the league against zero blitzes, it's not like there's a very straightforward answer. We got tight ends. We got some slot receivers. We've got outside receivers. We've got a tight end who mostly gets screen passes. We've got another deep threat here in Jamison Williams, and yet we also have the quick get open right away guy in Amon-Ra St. Brown. So there isn't really a trend we can go to say, yeah, let's use this guy on Las Vegas or on Denver facing Las Vegas. So that part's a little bit tough, but man, it's really nice to. Oh, I did it again. There are too many tabs to go through. Appreciate you letting me know, Cat Guy. Obviously, because I was in StatsHub, I didn't see the comment right away. But yeah, so let me here. I'll double back real quick. I think I did a decent job of actually saying it all, so you maybe didn't need to see it. But receiving coverages, shell coverage as cover zero, and now we're going to go to passing and just take a look at the yards per attempt number here. So Bo Nix, you can see some guys like up over 10. Like I said, there is some real opportunity for explosive plays when you are facing cover zero, not necessarily the deep ball, but guy gets open on a quick slant. If he beat his man, there's no one back there to make the tackle. He's just going to go the distance. So you can certainly see some explosive plays. I would love like A.J. Brown in this matchup, George Pickens in this matchup, something like that. The guy who gets open quick and has the speed to outrun whoever it is to the ends of a Bo Nix way down here. Only 12 pass attempts, 6 for 12 against 0 blitz. So we can't really pinpoint anybody on Denver who's going to take advantage of this matchup, and he hasn't performed great against it himself. The nice side of that is because he hasn't performed well against it, and we already know it's something Las Vegas likes to do, chances are he's going to see it, right? So if we can figure out who is that guy on Denver, there's a good chance that we'll hit. And that way we can also potentially just play Bo Nix there and say he's not going to struggle against it forever. He looks quite good as a rookie, already playing some really high-level football. So we could just go to Bo Nix here and try to take advantage of that. Problem there is there's not really anybody on the Las Vegas side that I want to use up against Denver. So we've got about 12 more minutes. If you guys have any questions on matchups that we haven't been through yet, let me know. Otherwise, I will just take us into the final 2 games, San Francisco, Green Bay, and Arizona, Seattle. So let's start there, shall we? Let's go Arizona and Seattle first. Arizona has really played some quality football of late. Wide receiver 3 is doing quite well, so maybe this is a Tyler Lockett game. But maybe there's also something in the coverages. And then Seattle, wide receiver 2 is doing quite well, so this is really not interesting at all across the board. Running back plus 6%, so it could be a nice spot for James Conner, but certainly nothing crazy standing out there. The adjusted line yards, let's take another look at that for these running backs. 20th, Arizona. Seattle, surprisingly. Oh, I just missed them. That's why. So it's not surprising. 28th. So I think right away I can say if somebody on Arizona does really well, James Conner is certainly one of the most likely candidates. However, let's look at some other coverage stuff. Let's bring StatsHub back up. Look at that. I remembered to switch the tab back over this time. Receiving, advanced. Let's clear the filters and let's look at some defenses. Looks like I need to refresh again. StatsHub is not used to having people on it for 6 consecutive hours like I have been today. Not really exaggerating either. I think it's been about 6 consecutive hours just looking at StatsHub, taking some breaks here and there, but I certainly enjoy StatsHub. And part of that was because I was writing a fun DVOA article breaking down how much Aaron Rodgers is to blame. So keep an eye out for that, especially if you are a Giants or a Jets fan and enjoy getting angry at your team. All right, let's see. What did I want? I want receiving, advanced, defense. Looking at Arizona and Seattle. I need to refresh again. I don't know this for sure, but I think if you start clicking things before it loads, that also contributes to it timing out at times. So I just need to be a little bit more patient, which is not one of my strong suits. All right, single high. We have Arizona 9th, Seattle down at 19th. So nothing really there. Not really for either, but certainly not for Seattle. And then 2 high coverages. Arizona 23rd, Seattle 10th. So again, nothing crazy there. How about man and zone rates? If I recall correctly, Arizona plays a lot of zone, and that was at least their style with Philly. Let's see. So Seattle, number 1 in zone. All right, that's something we can work with. That is something we can work with. So let's go. Player, receiving, advanced, teams. Let's look at Arizona, and we are looking at who does the best against zone coverages. Let's make sure we get that zone filter on. There we go. 2.7 yards per route run for Trey McBride, 2.1 for Marvin Harrison Jr., 1.7 for James Conner. For some comparison's sake, let's get rid of that filter and see how much better this is for each guy compared to their default. So McBride from 2.3 up to 2.7, Conner 1.3 up to, was it 1.7? Might have been 1.6 regardless. good spot for both McBride and Connor. So we certainly have that way to play the game. Not really anything on the Arizona defensive side to point us specifically to any of these Seattle guys, which makes me hopeful that people will overreact to last week, and maybe we get DK Metcalf $6,600 at fairly low ownership, 7 for 70 in his return last week on 9 targets, but was potentially overshadowed by Smith and Jigba, 10 for 110 on 11 targets, which we called here on this show based on the zone splits for who were they playing last week? San Francisco. So also the slot production, if I recall correctly, against San Francisco. So great spot last week for Smith and Jigba, potentially not as good this week. That does remind me, though, let's take a look at the slot stuff for this Arizona defense. Whoops, route location, alignment, slot. That can also help us pick between these guys and just evaluate this matchup. So overall yards, we know Detroit is there. Arizona 18th, so yards per route run. Where is Arizona here? 19th. So certainly not anywhere near as good of a matchup for Smith and Jigba, which makes me just think potentially going back to DK Metcalf, or like I mentioned earlier, the DVOA adjusted fantasy points against numbers points to this potentially being a Tyler Lockett bounce back spot. Lockett has not been super involved or super effective of late. Just 3 targets, 2 receptions, 19 yards last week. That was just about as bad as the matchup could get. Week prior, 4 targets, 3 receptions for 63 yards and a touchdown. Of course, that came with Metcalf out. So it was some disappointing production for Lockett without Metcalf. And it's not like he was lighting the world on fire even before that Metcalf injury, topping out at 16.5 fantasy points this season. So he is down to 4,800. That's probably the best thing I can say about this for Lockett, but it's going to depend on ownership in terms of my interest levels here. If Metcalf is popular, then I'd probably give Lockett a second look. If Metcalf is low owned, I'm not going to bother going to Tyler Lockett. I'll just play DK Metcalf. Let's see. All right. Finally, we have San Francisco and Green Bay. So let's keep some of that stuff that we just talked about with JSN in mind as we evaluate these teams. Let's look at the DVOA stuff first, and you'll see San Francisco, great matchup for wide receiver 2s. Let me take a quick look at who we are classifying as the wide receiver 2 now for Green Bay. We have Jaden Reed, wide receiver 1, Christian Watson, wide receiver 2. So with that, let's take a look at some of the stats. Actually, before we do that, let's take a look at Green Bay as well. We'll just do both. At the same time, Green Bay, pretty tough matchup all around, except tight ends, plus 12%. So George Kittle week, neutral matchup for Christian McCaffrey too. I don't think McCaffrey's ownership is going to drop a whole lot just because he failed last week, but if it does, we should jump all over that. We talked last week that it actually wasn't a great McCaffrey matchup I think it was in the passing game. We said it wasn't a great matchup for him. So maybe this one will be better. Let's just take a look. Let's go to StatsHub. Share this. Let me clear all of that stuff. So first, receiving, advanced, and defense. And let's look at the man rates first. Not seeing either, zone rates instead. Green Bay, 5th in zone. San Francisco, 6th in zone. So that is the starting point. Which receivers from this game really excel against zone coverage? I believe it's going to be Jaden Reed, if I recall correctly, but we will take a further look at that. Single high. Green Bay, 12th in single high. San Francisco, 16th. So nothing crazy there either. I know that both are low in zero coverage rate, so let's just make sure that they're not higher than expected here. 12th for San Francisco, 16th for Green Bay. So they flip-flop. So the only thing here is zone coverage rate that we need to be worried about. And then I also remember from last week, let's just go and do this one more time. Slot, apply this. And I believe we will see San Francisco near the top of these numbers. 11th. So not crazy, but yards per route run, 8.6, tied for fourth highest. So as I said last week, as we saw with JSN, good matchup out of the slot against San Francisco. So we'll keep that in mind as well. And just for fun, while we're here, let's take a look. Since I don't see them at the top, let's see wide for Green Bay. I don't think we'll see this I don't think we'll see them pop here since only tight ends have been producing more than average against them. And sure enough, yeah, they are not at the top of the list, just 16th. So, all right. With that, let's take a look at receiver production against zone coverage for these two teams. And I need the advanced filter, receiving coverages, zone. Sure enough, 4.0 yards per route run for Jaden Reed. That leads the league. I didn't even have to sort by team to find that. Juwan Jennings, 3.1. Also really, really noteworthy here in this matchup. So maybe a Jaden Reed, Juwan Jennings mini stack. You can also then maybe go with, oh, look at that. George Kittle, 16th in the league in yards per route run. So Purdy, Jennings, Kittle with a Jaden Reed bring back looks pretty spectacular from these numbers. Anything else from you guys? Yeah, Reed only $5,900. No question here for me. I would rather have Gibbs over 67.5. But like I said earlier in the show, I want to wait and see what we get for his longest rush. The longest rush for Gibbs might be something that we ladder like crazy as well. So I'm not opposed. If you have other picks you like already and want to get ahead of the curve, maybe you're worried that this Gibbs number is going to go up to 72.5, something like that by tomorrow. And maybe you want to get in on what was the receiver we talked about? Mike Evans, 55.5. If you want to get in on that and something else early, I have no problem doing that. And then once you get the longest rush, maybe you just only go for the really big multiplier. Certainly different ways you can play that. But yeah, I think we've got a lot to really like again this week. So just to kind of run through some of my favorite guys. I'll bring up underdog here, and this isn't necessarily just saying that I only like them on underdog. I don't even know what some of these numbers are going to look like yet, but just talking through everybody. Love Mike Evans from this game. I like Juwan Jennings based on what he has done against zone coverage. 53.5 isn't great by any means. Let's see where Kittle's at. 46.5 for George Kittle, I think, is really, really good, especially with Deebo Samuel. Kind of just I'm not impressed with what I see. He doesn't look explosive and fast, which makes me think that they'll try to get Kittle more involved offensively in the passing game, even with Juwan back. So, or even with McCaffrey back. Apologies there. Who else did we really like? Tyreek Hill, I think, is a phenomenal one. 65.5 is insanely low. 23.5 is insanely low. I will be on either of these. I will be laddering either of these. Not sure which ones are going to be my favorite yet, but you can count on that. And then the other big giant game stack that I liked, not just that Green Bay one with Jordan Love and Jaden Reed. Oh, reminds me, we should check Jaden Reed's numbers here. 48.5. My goodness. Has he really been that ineffective? 23, 113 the game prior against Detroit, 55 the game prior. God, this number is insanely low. 138, 139, 113. So he's been over 100 yards 3 times this season, and now he has a great matchup. Yeah, this is going to be laddered like crazy. 4.78x will hit that for sure. And then in the Detroit game, Jahmyr Gibbs, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Anthony Richardson, and Josh Downs was the stack there. Apologies if I am forgetting anybody else. Mike Evans, 1.5 touchdowns, 7.31x. That is awesome. Dr. Rose saying I have 8 I like after this stream. He's the one asking between Gibbs and Montgomery. Yeah, I think you're right. I've got a lot I like already. Hopefully they're all still there when I get back to Virginia tomorrow night, can actually place these. Yeah, I think this sets up really, really well for us once again. Hopefully the guys that we are on for DraftKings aren't super popular. Before you head out, please hit the like button. Also comment your favorite prop, comment your favorite part of StatsHub. What's your favorite thing to look at? Is it explosive passing yards? Comment something that I haven't done yet that you would like to see more of on this show, one statistic, one element of each matchup that I like looking at that we haven't really discussed in either one is blitz rate. I love finding guys, quarterbacks and receivers who excel against the blitz, against blitz-happy teams. Haven't done a ton of that on these shows, but it is going to be part of my analysis and will be in my articles as well. And if I find anything spectacular from that, last week there weren't really great ones. All the teams that blitzed a lot were either on bye, were off the main slate, or we're going up against teams who didn't have an obvious answer for who should do well against the blitz. Maybe we'll see more of that this week. Obviously ran out of time to really dive into that. And yeah, Tampa is one of the teams that blitzes a lot. So again, I wish Tommy DeVito wasn't the starter this week, but we'll be able to find some other show. Almost like you need one show about defense and one about offense. No, the thing is, like, you can't evaluate one without the other, right? It's how the teams are going to interact with each other. So you need to be talking about both at the same time. It just means that it's hard to get through all this stuff in an hour. Appreciate all you guys tuning in here. So reminder, comment, like the show, subscribe to the channel. If you watched on Twitter, reminder, you can always find the show live on YouTube as well. And another reminder, if you showed up late, no problem. You can watch the replay any point in the week. I also kind of recommend by Saturday, by Friday night, you might have forgotten a lot of this stuff. So maybe just come back, give it a second watch specifically for your DraftKings lineups and look at all that stuff. One last thing I'll mention, I'm going to be incorporating more and more of these findings into our actual projections, which means they will also be captured in the GPP scores, given how successful this type of analysis has been. Like I said earlier, everybody knows Detroit is going to do well this week, or at least everyone expects them to do well this week. If your big thought for the week is, I think Detroit's going to do well, you're not gaining an edge on anybody. You need to find those micro advantages that other people aren't finding, not the macro advantages like team totals, things like that. That's what this show's all about. That's what we are all about here at FTN. Appreciate you guys once again, and we'll have some very, very exciting news coming out either at the end of this week, early next week for the Thanksgiving slate. So stay tuned for that. It's big and it is exciting. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Catch you next time.